On February 12, 2015, Chris Sylvia set out on a section hike of the Pacific Crest Trail in Southern California. Chris kept a pretty low profile, and so we don't really know a lot about how his hike started. And unfortunately, we know even less about how it ended. A few days into the hike, Chris Sylvia called his roommate slash best friend in order to get picked up from the trail. They chose a time and place to meet, and when that time rolled around, Chris's friend showed up, but Chris did not. It didn't take long before people became concerned about Chris, and the same day that the search was started, investigators made a discovery that looked innocent at first, but would soon prove to be anything but that. It may not look like much, but I think that this is the most disturbing photo in Pacific Crest Trail history. It features pretty much all of Chris's gear laid out right on the side of the trail. And yet, despite finding this just a few days after Chris went missing, he was never seen again. We don't know who arranged Chris's gear like that. It could have been him, certainly, and there's also some suspicion that it could have been somebody else. Either way, whoever was present at that scene likely holds the answers to one of the strangest disappearances in Pacific Crest Trail history. Now, when I was on the PCT in 2022, I grew out what must have been one of the most disgusting beards of all time. And what I really should have done was trimmed that thing up using the Manscaped Beard Hedger Pro Kit. That's right, Manscaped is the sponsor of this video. I was hoping they would let me talk about shaving my balls or something, but after they saw that photo of my beard, yeah, they knew that needed to be the focus here. As soon as I opened up the box for the Beard Hedger Pro Kit, I knew I was gonna love it. They got the beard oil, the beard shampoo and conditioner, the beard balm, which all this stuff smells so good, by the way, that I could smell it as soon as I opened up the box. And then of course you have the star of the show, the Beard Hedger itself. The Beard Hedger has 20 different hair cutting lengths, and you actually use this zoom wheel to switch between them, which is so convenient, so awesome. It means you only need one guard. It's just way better than having like a bunch of other useless guard attachments just cluttering up your bathroom drawers. Another thing I love is that the Beard Hedger is cordless, it's rechargeable, and it's waterproof. So you can trim your beard while you're showering to save time and create less mess. Go to manscaped.com/KyleHatesHiking or use promo code KyleHatesHiking at checkout. You'll get 20% off your order and free shipping, even international shipping outside the US. Manscaped.com/KyleHatesHiking. And with that said, let's get into the story. In mid-February 2015, 28-year-old Chris Sylvia decided that he needed to get away from home for a little bit to clear his head. In order to do this, he set out to hike a portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, which is a long-distance footpath that runs border to border from Mexico to Canada. The portion of the trail that Chris was on is much closer to the Mexican border, however, and on February 12th, Chris started out near the town of Anza and began hiking south. It seems as though his intention was to hike nearly 150 miles all the way down to Campo, California, which is right on the Mexican border. It's also the southern terminus of the trail, but I'm not exactly sure about this. I only saw a few reports that said that. There's not much known about the first few days of Chris's hike. It seems like he kept a pretty low profile, and there's also not a lot of people on the PCT that time of year, although it's certainly not unheard of. The first known contact that anyone had with Chris after he started his hike, at least that I was able to find, was on February 16th, 4 days after his departure. And unfortunately, this would also be the last contact that anybody had with him. On this day, Chris called his best friend slash roommate in order to arrange a meetup for the next day. I actually had the pleasure of speaking to Chris's brother about this arranged meetup and the circumstances leading up to it, and this is what he told me. Apparently, there had been some tension between Chris and this friend due to work and living circumstances, and a big reason why Chris had actually gone on this hike in the first place was that so he could get out there and clear his head and, quote, work things out for himself. On February 16th, Chris had apparently called this friend kind of out of the blue, like the friend wasn't really expecting it, and Chris asked the friend to pick him up the next day, but he kind of caught the friend at a bad time, and so Chris didn't really get the answer that he was expecting or hoping for, and this left him hurt and taken aback. However, the two were still able to agree on a time and place for the meeting, and it was scheduled for the next day, February February 17th at a Buddhist temple on Chihuahua Road. Now, this temple isn't directly on the PCT. For my calculations, it's about 5 miles off the trail. It's not uncommon for people to go off the trail to random spots like this when they're on backpacking trips. Although I will say I hiked most of the PCT in 2022, and when I went through here, I didn't hear or see any signs, nothing about this Buddhist temple. On February 17th, Chris's friend showed up at the temple at the exact time that he was supposed to, but Chris didn't. Now, in hindsight, Chris not showing up probably should have been a pretty big red flag, and a search probably should have been started right there and then, but that's not what happened. Chris's friend waited there for him for about an hour, and then he had to get going because he had another obligation, and he simply figured that Chris had decided to just keep hiking and just hadn't bothered to tell him about it. This is what he assumed, and he didn't really think that much of it, apparently. It probably wasn't a wise assumption, but I'm not going to judge the friend too much here because apparently him and Chris were literally best friends. They were very close, and it seems like there's no doubt that this friend really did have the best intentions in mind, especially because about a week later on February 24th, it was this same friend that ended up alerting authorities when Chris never showed up at the end of his hike. It's at this point that the search for Chris was started. Multiple agencies came together, including Sheriff's Department volunteers, San Diego Mountain Rescue, and even the US Border Patrol. They searched the ground on foot and with canine units and the air by helicopter. The search teams were definitely a formidable force, but unfortunately they weren't able to locate Chris. However, it wasn't long before they were able to locate what seemed like a pretty promising clue, though ultimately this clue would just end up raising even more questions than it answered. On February 24th, the same day that Chris was reported missing, some hikers found a sleeping bag, a sleeping pad, a backpack, and some other gear laid out on the side of the PCT. It was quickly determined that this gear belonged to Chris Sylvia, and they even actually found his ID with all of the gear. The location on the trail that they found all of this gear is kind of interesting to me. It's right around mile 127. Now, when I hiked through this area back in 2022, I didn't know about Chris's case. However, I do remember this specific part of the trail because it's very close to a common PCT stopping point called Mike's Place. I only stopped at Mike's Place very briefly just to fill up my water bottles, but my understanding is that it's basically a private residence that has some services for hikers. They'll let you camp on the property, cook you some food, maybe shuttle you into town. I'm not really exactly sure, but people who just basically open up their property and their home to hikers when they live really close to the trail is pretty common on all long distance trails. Chris's gear was found laid out right on the side of the trail, just a few hundred feet away from the intersecting trail that leads over to Mike's Place. This location also happens to be only a few hundred feet away from the intersecting Lost Valley Road, which is the remote dirt road that Chris would have taken to get over to the Buddhist temple to meet his friend. The search for Chris continued for 2 weeks, and other than the discovery of all of his gear on the side of the trail, no other sign of Chris was found. No known sightings of Chris occurred. It was almost as though he had just simply vanished. And unfortunately, at this 2-week mark, the search for Chris was suspended indefinitely. Jan Cadwell, who was the San Diego County spokesperson at the time, was quoted saying, "It's been 2 weeks since he was last heard from, and the weather has made a productive search impossible." So I guess they basically just called off the search because of some really, really bad storms. The search was stopped, but the investigation continued, obviously. But unfortunately, that was pretty much the last update that I've ever heard of from Chris's case. And so at this point, I really have nowhere to go back to except for the photograph. This photo isn't shocking, it doesn't really jump out at you, and it doesn't even really look that out of the ordinary. However, this photo just really creeps me out, and I think it's because I can't tell why Chris's gear is laid out like that. For those of you that are new here, I'm not just a storyteller, I'm an avid backpacker and thru hiker myself. And so I'm trying to look at this photograph through the lens of my experience on the trail and try to figure out what exactly is going on here. And honestly, it just confuses me. The first thing that comes to mind is that Chris laid out his gear like this to do what us thru hikers call cowboy camping, which is when you sleep on the ground without any sort of shelter. Like, you don't set up your tent, you don't do anything. It's extremely common for PCT hikers to sleep like this. A lot of people do it when they're on the trail. However, I'm not sure that this is what he was doing, because when you look at the photo a little bit closer, it looks like his sleeping pad is actually set up like kind of at a slant. You can also see a few rocks underneath the pad, so I don't know, it just doesn't really look very comfortable. There's no shortage of flat, clear spots to lay down on this part of the PCT, so I don't know, the cowboy camping thing just seems unlikely to me. The next plausible scenario is that Chris maybe just stopped to take a lunch break there or some sort of break, and that would explain why he didn't really pay much attention to where he put his pad down. However, if that was the case, why would he have taken out his sleeping bag? That's not really a normal thing for hikers to do when they're just stopped in the middle of the day. It's possible that since it was February, after all, he was cold, and so he took it out in order to get some more warmth. It's also possible that maybe his sleeping bag got wet somehow, and so he was laying it out like that to dry it. I don't know. I have a lot of questions about why his gear was laid out like that, but at the end of the day, I don't know if it really matters that much, because there's a much bigger question at stake here, and that's why wasn't Chris with all of his gear? I'm gonna be honest, guys, I don't always put my opinion in here, but my opinion is that this photo looks staged. That's just me. I don't have any real evidence of this, and there's probably a lot of people that are going to disagree that are much smarter than I am. But I don't know, just the circumstances of the case and just the way things are laid out, the location of it, something just seems off. Let me know in the comments if you guys think it looks staged or what you think is going on here. It's just very bizarre, and unfortunately, all we can really do at this point is speculate and just go through a few scenarios that could have possibly led to Chris disappearing. The first scenario is that Chris could have staged the scene with his gear like that in order to throw off investigators and then simply ran away. He could have done this to run off and take his own life, or he could have done this to get away and just start a new life somewhere. Again, this is total speculation. I don't have any real evidence for either one of these theories, but I will say that in some online forums and discussions, Chris's brother did seem somewhat open to the idea that maybe Chris did just run off somewhere to start a new life. In one forum, Chris's brother wrote, "He's certainly the type to just go running off without telling anyone." Now, Chris's brother didn't say that he's like 100% convinced that this is what happened, but he did say that he could certainly see it being a possibility. It's also known that Chris was suffering from depression at the time of his disappearance, and he had even attempted to take his own life some years earlier. And so, as much as it pains me to bring this up, of course, I do think that it's fair to at least float the possibility that maybe he ran off and attempted to take his own life again. That being said, I'm gonna keep saying this, but I just want to be clear, like, we don't have any actual evidence of this. There was no note ever found. As far as I'm aware, there's no other indication that this was what happened other than the fact that he was depressed and he had attempted it years earlier. So I don't know. The last scenario that involves Chris intentionally disappearing was actually brought up to me once again by his brother. He speculated that it's possible that Chris was recruited by the 12 Tribes cult and was encouraged to leave his belongings behind and not contact anyone. I'll admit this scenario seems pretty far-fetched to me, although it is true that 12 Tribes has a presence on the PCT as well as lots of other long-distance trails such as the Appalachian Trail. I actually made an entire video on the 12 Tribes and their relation to the Appalachian Trail a few months ago. I'll have a link to it right here if you're curious. When I hiked the PCT, I didn't see or hear anything about 12 Tribes being out there, but I have since heard from other hikers who said they did interact with 12 Tribes at some point along their hike, so I don't know, they're definitely on the PCT. Now, that alone is certainly not evidence that they have anything to do with Chris's disappearance, obviously, but I don't know, it's a theory that's been floated out there by some people, and Chris's brothers seemed to be somewhat interested in that theory. So because of that, I thought that it would definitely be worth mentioning here. So now let's discuss the very real possibility that Chris did not disappear willingly, aka the possibility that maybe he was met with foul play. The first scenario that may have popped into a lot of your heads is that Chris's best friend slash roommate may have had something to do with his disappearance. This was one of the first things that I thought of because, again, his friend was supposed to meet him. His friend, I guess, would have been the last person to see him if Chris had showed up up on time. I don't have any evidence to support or contradict this theory. I will say though, the authorities have never once come out, at least that I'm aware of, and named this roommate slash best friend as a suspect in Chris's disappearance. And Chris's brother, who has spoken with this roommate many times over the years, also never gave me any indication that he was suspicious of the friend. We know that this friend and Chris were very close. I've described them as best friends a few times in the video. That's my understanding. And so I don't know, it just seems unlikely that this friend would have caused him any harm. It's also worth mentioning that this section of the PCT Chris was on is fairly close to the Mexican border, which opens up the possibility that he could have accidentally come across an illegal drug smuggling operation and ran into trouble with that. However, while his location is close to the border, it's far enough away that the likelihood of this happening is very low. A quick measure on Google Maps shows that the location where Chris's gear was found is about 55 miles straight line from the Mexican border, and there's also numerous roads and towns that intersect that line. So I don't know, this theory just seems pretty improbable to me. And then of course there's always the possibility that he could have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and run into some sort of person that was just looking to cause trouble. Again, no evidence of this. I don't know what happened to Chris. I don't know what's going on in this photo. I don't know why his gear was laid out like that. It's been almost 8 years since Chris disappeared, and none of the questions that we have about this case have ever been answered. Hopefully some answers are revealed soon. If you do happen to have any information about this case, please contact the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. And of course, my heart goes out to Chris and to his family. I know there's a lot of future PCT hikers that will be watching this video, so if that's you, just keep your eyes peeled when you're hiking through this area, the section of Mike's Place around mile 127. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. My goal is 200,000 subscribers. I recently hit 150,000, and I'm so grateful for everyone who helped me get there. 200,000 is the next goal. Let's do it, let's run it, and thank you guys very much for watching.